Beloved in Christ, welcome to Found by Grace. Before you watch another second, I want you to ask yourself one question. What if the testimony you're about to hear is the reminder you've been praying for? Sometimes God speaks through the most unexpected stories, at the most unexpected moments, and today's testimony may reveal something you desperately need to hear. Maybe you've been praying for a breakthrough that seems impossible. Maybe you're carrying a burden you haven't told anyone about. Or perhaps your faith has been shaken, and you're quietly wondering whether God still sees, hears, and remembers you. Stay with us until the end, because there is something about this testimony that may challenge the way you see God's grace, His timing, and the unexpected ways He can transform a life. Please leave a comment with your name, country, city, and the exact local time you are watching. Our prayer team faithfully reads every comment and prays over each request, believing that God hears every cry and cares deeply about every heart. Now here is the testimony. My name is Imam Abdul Rahman. I was 47 years old, living with my wife and 2 daughters in Lahore, Pakistan, near the quiet streets of Model Town. I had spent more than 20 years teaching the Quran, leading prayers, answering religious questions, and advising people who came to me when their marriages were breaking, when their children were lost, or when fear entered their homes. I thought I understood faith, I thought I understood prayer, I thought I understood Jesus. I was wrong. The strangest part is that I am not beginning this testimony at the beginning. I am beginning with the moment when my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold my prayer beads. It was somewhere after midnight in Mecca. The crowds around the holy mosque had become thinner, but the city was still glowing beneath the night sky. I was sitting several steps away from 2 men I had known for years, Imam Farooq and Imam Salman. The 3 of us had traveled from Pakistan together for pilgrimage, and earlier that evening we had been discussing matters of faith, as we often did, but now none of us was speaking. We were staring toward the same place. A man was sitting several yards away from us, dressed in a simple white garment. There was something about his presence that made the air around us feel strangely still. I remember looking at Farooq and seeing fear in his eyes. That frightened me more than the stranger himself, because Farooq was not a man who frightened easily. Then something happened that I have struggled to describe ever since. The man looked toward us, and although I could not explain how, I felt as though he knew things about my life that I had never told another human being. Not general things, personal things. Things hidden behind my prayers, things buried beneath years of religious work, things I was ashamed to admit even to myself. My first thought was that someone had told him about me. My second thought was that perhaps I was dreaming, but then Imam Salman quietly moved closer to me and whispered that he was experiencing the same strange feeling. We had not discussed our private fears with each other, yet all 3 of us were beginning to realize that this encounter was not ordinary. The man did not announce his name. He did not demand that we follow him. He did not perform some dramatic miracle. Instead, he spoke to us calmly, and as I listened, I felt something inside me breaking apart. He revealed truths about my heart that were so painful that I wanted to get up and walk away. He told me that I had spent years teaching people to trust God while secretly carrying fear that God had not truly forgiven me. He showed me that my religious knowledge had become something I used to protect myself from questions I was afraid to ask. And then he revealed something about my younger brother, a man I had not seen for 11 years because of a bitter family argument. That was the moment my confidence disappeared. I looked at Imam Farooq. He was crying, not quietly, not the kind of tears a person wipes away and pretends never happened. His shoulders were trembling. Then Imam Salman lowered his head and began to weep too. I had known these men for years. We had prayed together, taught together, traveled together, and argued about theology more times than I could remember, but I had never seen either man cry like that. The stranger's presence seemed to expose something we had spent our whole lives hiding, and then he revealed the one thing that made my heart nearly stop. He told me that I had been searching for God in the wrong place, not because I had been praying too little, but because I had been afraid to surrender the part of my heart I could not control. He revealed that forgiveness was not something I could earn by appearing righteous before other people. Then he spoke about Jesus in a way I had never heard before. I remember the exact moment I looked at him and wondered, "Who are you?" But before I could ask, the night suddenly felt different. And that was when I realized something that terrified me. the most important part of this encounter had not happened yet. To understand why three Pakistani Imams were sitting in Mecca after midnight, trembling before a stranger who seemed to know the deepest secrets of our hearts, I have to take you back to Lahore. 6 weeks earlier, to the day I received a phone call that would eventually lead me there. That phone call began with only 7 words. 6 weeks before that night in Mecca, I was sitting alone in my small study in Lahore, Pakistan, after the evening prayer. Rain had been falling for almost an hour, and I could hear water running along the street outside our house on Model Town. My wife Amina was preparing tea in the kitchen, while my younger daughter Mariam was doing her schoolwork in the next room. I had just finished reading when my phone rang. The number was not saved. Normally I would have ignored it, but something made me answer. At first there was silence, then I heard the voice of a young man. He sounded nervous, almost as if he had been walking while speaking. He told me his name was Hamza and said he needed to see me because he had been having dreams about Jesus. I remember becoming uncomfortable immediately. I had heard many strange stories during my years as an imam, and people often came looking for answers after frightening dreams. I asked him where he lived, and he gave me an address in Lahore, not far from where I taught. Then he said something that stayed in my mind long after the call ended. He told me that in his dreams, Jesus was standing at the door of his house, but every time Hamza tried to open the door, he woke up. I told him to come and speak with me the next afternoon. When I hung up, I tried to forget the conversation, but I could not. That night, I slept badly. Around 3 in the morning, I woke suddenly with a strange feeling that someone was standing outside my bedroom. I got up, checked the hallway, and found nothing. I returned to bed, but before I closed my eyes, I found myself thinking about Jesus. I had taught about him many times. I had explained what I believed about him to hundreds of people. Yet for some reason, that night I asked myself a question I had never seriously asked before. What if I had been speaking about Jesus all these years, without ever truly understanding why his name continued to trouble so many hearts? The next afternoon, Hamza arrived looking exhausted. He was about 24 years old, thin, quiet, and nervous. He sat across from me in my study and kept rubbing his hands together. I asked him to tell me everything from the beginning, and he explained that the dreams had started after his mother became seriously ill. His mother had been a deeply religious woman, and when her health began to fail, Hamza became angry with God. He said that one night, while sitting beside her hospital bed, he had silently asked God for a sign that his prayers were not meaningless. That night he dreamed of a man dressed in white standing outside his childhood home. Hamza said he somehow knew the man was Jesus, although the man never introduced himself. In the dream, Jesus did not frighten him. Instead, Hamza felt an overwhelming sense of peace, followed by a deep sadness. Then the dream ended. It happened again the next night, and again several nights later. I listened carefully, but inside I was becoming more troubled. I asked him whether anyone had been talking to him about Christianity. He said no. I asked whether he had watched Christian programs or videos. Again he said no. Then he reached into his pocket and placed a folded piece of paper on my desk. He told me he had written down something he remembered from the last dream because he was afraid he would forget it. I unfolded the paper and read a sentence describing a journey to a holy city at night. I looked up at him and asked why he had written that particular thing. He said he did not know. But then he told me that the same night he wrote it, he had seen 3 men standing behind Jesus in the dream. He could not see their faces clearly, but he believed they were religious leaders. I felt a chill move through me because, at that exact moment, I remembered something I had almost forgotten. A few days earlier, Imam Farooq had called me and said he had been invited to discuss a pilgrimage journey. He wanted me to travel with him and another imam, Imam Salman. I had dismissed the idea because I was busy. Now I suddenly wondered whether these events were connected. I did not tell Hamza what I was thinking. Instead, I asked him to pray and remain calm. But after he left, I closed my study door, sat in silence, and stared at that piece of paper for several minutes. There was one detail on it that I could not explain. Hamza had written the words 3 men, 1 night, Mecca. I had never told him about my possible journey, and as far as I knew, neither had Farooq or Salman. That evening I called Imam Farooq. He answered after several rings, and when I asked about the journey, he became strangely quiet. He told me that Imam Salman had also spoken about it, and the three of us were expected to travel together. I asked him whether he had ever spoken to a young man named Hamza. He said no. I then asked whether he had heard anything about dreams involving Jesus. Again, he said no. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Farouk told me something that made my stomach tighten. He said that 2 nights earlier, he had dreamed that he was standing in Mecca after midnight, but the strange thing was that the Kaaba was behind him and not in front of him. In the dream, someone was calling his name from the darkness. He could not see the person's face, but he felt compelled to turn around. When he did, he saw a man in white standing beneath a bright light. Farouk said he woke before the man spoke, but he remembered one thing clearly. He felt as if the man already knew every question he had been afraid to ask. I told Farouk about Hamza's paper, and there was a long silence on the phone. Neither of us knew what to make of it. We agreed to speak with Salman the following morning. But that night before I went to bed, another phone call came. It was from Hamza. His voice was shaking. He told me he had dreamed again. This time, he said, the three men in the dream had faces. He could see them clearly. One was old, one had a gray beard, and one looked like a man he had never met before. Then he described the third man. My heart began beating faster because the description sounded like Imam Salman, but Hamza had never met Salman. Before I could ask another question, Hamza said something that made me sit upright in my chair. He told me that in the dream, the three men were walking toward Mecca, and someone was walking ahead of them. He could not hear what that person was saying, but he knew that the three men were going to meet him. Then the phone suddenly went silent. I called Hamza back twice. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. For the first time in my life, I felt afraid of a journey I had not even begun. The next morning, Imam Salman arrived at my house before sunrise, and I knew from his face that something serious had happened. He did not even remove his shoes properly before asking whether Farouk had already spoken to me. I told him that Farouk had called the previous night, and Salman slowly sat down across from me. His hands were trembling. He told me that he had spent most of the night awake because he had experienced something he could not explain. According to Salman, he had been praying alone in his room when he suddenly felt an unusual heaviness in the room, followed by a deep sense of peace. He closed his eyes, and in his mind he saw a road at night. The road seemed empty, but at the end of it he could see a bright city. 3 men were walking together, and one of them was Salman himself. He said the other 2 looked like Farouk and me. Then he saw the same man Hamza had described, standing ahead of them. Salman told me that the man did not speak with ordinary words, yet Salman understood that he was being shown something about forgiveness. But the part that frightened him came afterward. He saw himself holding an old photograph of his father, a man who had died many years earlier. Salman had carried guilt about his father for most of his adult life because their final conversation had ended in anger. He had never told Farouk or me the full story. In the vision, he felt as though someone was showing him that his religious work could never replace the love and forgiveness he had refused to give his own family. When Salman opened his eyes, he was crying. Then he reached into his pocket and showed me a small piece of paper. On it he had written 3 words before he could forget them: "Go, but listen." I stared at those words, and suddenly the journey to Mecca no longer felt like an ordinary pilgrimage. I told Salman about Hamza, the dreams, and the paper with the words 3 men, 1 night, Mecca. For several minutes we simply sat there. Then Farouk arrived, and when he heard everything, he became silent. None of us wanted to say what was slowly forming in our minds. A few days later, our journey began from Pakistan. At the airport, I hugged my wife Amina and told her I would return soon. She looked at me for a moment and asked why I seemed distracted. I told her I was simply tired, but she knew me too well. Before I left, she placed her hand on my arm and reminded me to pray for our family. I nodded, but there was something I could not tell her. I was carrying Hamza's folded paper inside the inner pocket of my bag. During the flight, Farouk slept for a while, Salman read quietly, and I stared through the window at the darkness below us. I kept thinking about my younger brother, Yusuf. We had once been close, but an argument over our father's property had destroyed our relationship. I had told myself for years that I was right, and that Yusuf was the one who needed to apologize. But after Hamza's visit, a question kept returning to me. What if I had been protecting my pride while calling it righteousness? I did not like the question. I tried to push it away, but it followed me. When we arrived in Saudi Arabia and eventually reached Mecca, the atmosphere was overwhelming. The lights, the people, the prayers, the movement, and the sight of the Kaaba affected me more deeply than I expected. For the first 2 days, everything seemed normal. We prayed, rested, spoke with other pilgrims, and kept the strange dreams to ourselves. But on the third evening, something happened that made it impossible for me to believe the journey was ordinary. Farouk received a message from Pakistan. It was from Hamza. The message contained only a photograph and a short note saying that he had dreamed about us again. I opened the photograph and immediately felt cold. It showed a page from Hamza's notebook. On the page was a rough drawing of 3 men standing in front of a dark square building, with a fourth figure sitting several steps away. Underneath the drawing, Hamza had written the date. It was the exact date we had planned to be in Mecca. None of us had told him the date. I looked at Farouk and he looked at Salman. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in all 3 of us. Salman suggested that we should forget the whole thing and focus on our pilgrimage. I agreed, but that night, as we returned to our room, I noticed something strange. The folded paper I had kept inside my bag was no longer where I had placed it. I searched through every pocket, nothing. I emptied the bag onto the floor, still nothing. Then I remembered that I had left my notebook near the prayer area earlier that evening. I went back alone to look for it. The place was quieter now, and most people had moved toward their rooms. I found the notebook where I had left it, but when I opened it, the missing paper was lying inside. I knew I had not put it there. My hands began to shake as I unfolded it. The original words were still there, but underneath them was something new, written in handwriting that was not mine. I could not understand where it had come from, and I almost dropped the paper when I read the final sentence. It said that before the night was over, one of us would have to choose between defending what we had always believed and following the truth wherever it led. I stood there alone, surrounded by the distant sound of prayer, and felt an argument begin inside my heart. Part of me wanted to throw the paper away and tell myself it was a trick. Another part of me remembered Hamza's dreams, Salman's vision, Farouk's fear, and the things I had begun to question about my own life. I returned to our room without telling the others what I had found. I hid the paper beneath my clothing and tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. Around midnight, I heard Farouk get up. A few minutes later, Salman followed him. I quietly opened my eyes and saw them leaving the room. I waited, wondering where they were going. Then I heard the door close. Something inside me told me to follow them. I put on my shoes and stepped into the hallway. The building was quiet. I could see Farouk and Salman walking ahead of me toward the night outside. I followed at a distance, asking myself why 2 men who had been my friends for years would suddenly leave without telling me. As we moved through the streets, the sound of distant prayers became softer, and the bright lights seemed to fade behind us. Then Farouk stopped. Salman stopped beside him. I stopped several steps away. They were both looking toward a quiet area ahead. I followed their gaze and saw a man sitting alone in white. My heart began pounding. I recognized him immediately, not because I had seen his face before, but because his appearance matched the description Hamza had given me weeks earlier. Farouk turned toward me, his face pale. Salman whispered that he had seen this man in his dream. None of us moved. The stranger slowly raised his head and looked directly at us. Then he stood. And when he began walking toward the 3 of us, I suddenly understood why Hamza had told me that the most important part of the dream always happened after the 3 men arrived in Mecca. The man walked toward us slowly, and with every step my heart seemed to beat harder. I remember thinking that I should turn around, return to the hotel, and forget everything that had happened since Hamza first called me in Lahore. Yet my feet would not move. Farouk stood beside me with his hands pressed together, while Salman kept looking from the man to me, as if he wanted me to explain what none of us could explain. The stranger stopped several steps away. He looked ordinary in some ways. He wore simple white clothing, his hair was covered, and his face was calm. There was no dramatic light around him, no sign that would allow us to point to him and say that he was something supernatural. That almost made the moment more frightening. He looked at each of us for several seconds, and I felt as though he was not looking at our clothes, our positions, or our titles, but directly at our hearts. Then he began speaking. I will not claim that I heard an audible voice from heaven, or that I can prove this was physically Jesus. This is a dramatized testimony, and what I experienced in the story is presented as a spiritual encounter. but in that moment, I understood his message with a clarity I had never experienced before. He revealed to me that I had spent years building an image of myself as a man who knew God, while secretly being afraid that I did not know him as deeply as I claimed. He revealed things about Farouk and Salman too, and their reactions told me that the message was touching wounds they had never discussed. Farouk began crying when the man brought up his anger toward his eldest son, whom he had refused to speak to for nearly 2 years. Salman lowered his face when the stranger revealed his regret over the last argument with his father. Then the man turned toward me. I could not breathe normally. He revealed the name Yusuf, and suddenly I felt as though the ground beneath me had disappeared. He reminded me of the last time my brother had stood outside my house in Lahore, asking me to forgive him. I had refused. I had told him that I was an imam and could not accept disrespect from my own family. The stranger revealed that I had confused being respected with being righteous. That sentence struck me harder than any criticism I had ever received. I wanted to defend myself, but there was nothing to defend. I knew exactly what he meant. Then the stranger did something none of us expected. Instead of asking us to prove our faith, he began speaking about love, mercy, humility, and Jesus. He revealed that many people spend their lives arguing about God while failing to obey the simple things God has already placed before them. Forgive the person who hurt you, care for the poor. Protect the weak, pray with a sincere heart, and stop using religion as a reason to hate people. As he spoke, I felt a strange conflict inside me. One part of me wanted to ask theological questions. I wanted to know his identity, his authority, and how he could know the private details of our lives. But another part of me was tired of questions. I had spent years asking whether other people believed correctly while avoiding the question of whether my own heart had become hard. The stranger then revealed something about Jesus that shook me. He showed me that I had treated Jesus mainly as a subject of religious debate instead of considering the meaning of his call to forgiveness and surrender. He revealed that following God was not supposed to make me proud, cruel, or suspicious of everyone who disagreed with me. It was supposed to make me more truthful, more humble, and more willing to love. I looked at Farouk and he was crying openly. Salman was also crying, but then he suddenly stepped forward and asked the question we had all been afraid to ask. He wanted to know whether the man before us was Jesus. The stranger did not give us the simple answer we expected. Instead, he revealed that we should not chase signs while ignoring the truth already placed in front of us. He revealed that the most important miracle was not seeing something supernatural in the darkness, but allowing God to change a heart that had become proud. Then he looked at each of us again, and I felt a deep peace mixed with fear. I wanted him to stay. I wanted him to explain everything. I wanted certainty. But he seemed more interested in what we would do after the encounter than in satisfying our curiosity. He revealed that each of us had someone we needed to forgive, someone we needed to seek, and something in our own hearts that we needed to surrender. Then he turned his attention to me and revealed one final thing. My brother Yusuf had been waiting for me to call him for years. I felt tears running down my face. I had not spoken to Yusuf in 11 years, but suddenly I could remember his voice, his laughter, and the way he used to bring tea into my study when we were young. I remembered how easily I had allowed one argument to become 11 years of silence. I wanted to ask the stranger how he knew. I wanted to ask him where Yusuf was. But before I could speak, the man began walking away. Farouk took a step after him and Salman followed. I followed too. We called out, but the man did not turn around. He continued walking until he reached a darker part of the street. For a few seconds, we could still see the white clothing moving ahead of us. Then a group of pilgrims passed between us, and when they had moved away, the man was gone. There was nowhere nearby where he could have disappeared so quickly. We searched the surrounding area. We asked a few people whether they had seen a man in white walking through the area, but no one seemed to know what we were talking about. Eventually, we returned to our room in silence. Nobody wanted to sleep. We sat together until dawn, and for the first time in our lives, 3 religious teachers had no sermon to give each other. We simply sat there and cried. When the morning prayer came, I felt different, but I still had one question burning inside me. If this encounter had been a message from God, what was I supposed to do with it? Then my phone began ringing. I looked at the screen and almost dropped it. The caller was Yusuf. My brother, whom I had not spoken to in 11 years, was calling me from Pakistan. I stared at his name for several seconds without answering. Farouk asked who it was. I showed him the screen. He immediately told me to answer, but I was afraid. What if Yusuf was calling to insult me? What if he wanted money? What if he had heard some rumor? What if I answered and discovered that nothing had changed? The phone kept ringing. I finally pressed the answer button, but before I could say a word, I heard my brother crying on the other end. He told me he had been awake most of the night because he had dreamed about our father. Then he said something that made the room go completely silent. He said that in his dream, our father had told him that it was time for the two brothers to stop fighting. I closed my eyes and the tears came before I could control them. When I finished speaking with Yusuf, I remained seated on the edge of the bed with the phone still in my hand. I could hear Farouk and Salman talking quietly, but their voices seemed far away. My mind kept returning to the stranger, his calm face, and the way he had revealed the name Yusuf before my brother called me. I wanted an explanation that would fit neatly inside everything I already believed, but nothing seemed to fit. Then I remembered the message we had received from Hamza. I opened my phone and found that he had sent another message while I was speaking with Yusuf. It said that he had awakened from another dream and had seen the three of us sitting in a room after meeting a man in white. According to Hamza, the man had not asked us to leave our faith behind. Instead, he had shown us that our hearts needed to become clean before our words could have meaning. Hamza then said something that made me stop breathing for a moment. He said the man had shown him a fourth person standing far away from us, and that person was holding an old photograph. Hamza did not know who the person was. I immediately thought of Yusuf and the photograph of our father that my brother had kept after his death. I showed the message to Farouk and Salman. Farouk read it twice before handing the phone back to me. Salman asked me to call Hamza. I did, and when he answered, his voice sounded different. He was crying. He told me that his mother had taken a turn for the worse during the night, but before she became unconscious, she had asked him why he was afraid. Hamza said he had told her about the dreams, expecting her to become frightened, but instead she had smiled weakly and told him that perhaps God was teaching him not to be afraid of truth. Then she asked him to pray for us. I remember sitting there thinking about the strange chain of events. A young man in Lahore had dreamed about 3 religious leaders. One of those men had dreamed about a journey, another had dreamed about forgiveness. I had received a message about my brother. Then the 3 of us had encountered a mysterious man in Mecca who spoke about the exact wounds hidden inside our hearts. I still did not know what to call the experience. Later that morning, we decided to return to the place where we had seen the stranger. We walked slowly, saying very little. The city had become busy again, and the quietness of the previous night was gone. People were moving in every direction, some carrying bags, some speaking softly, some heading toward prayer. I kept looking at faces, wondering whether I would see the man again. Nothing happened for several minutes. Then Salman stopped near a small shop and pointed toward something on the ground. It was a folded piece of white cloth. He picked it up, but there was nothing special about it. Farouk told us not to turn every ordinary thing into a sign. I agreed with him, yet something about the cloth reminded me of the stranger. We continued walking until we reached a quieter area. There, I saw an elderly man sitting alone. He was not the stranger, but something about him caught my attention. We approached him and greeted him. He asked where we were from, and when we said Pakistan, he smiled and told us he had lived in Lahore many years earlier. Then he asked whether we had come because of a dream. My heart stopped for a second. Farouk looked at me. Salman stepped closer. The elderly man explained that he had not seen us before and had no knowledge of our dreams. He simply said that many people come to holy places carrying questions they are afraid to ask. Then he told us something simple that became one of the most important lessons of my life. He said that a person could spend years standing in a sacred place while carrying hatred in his heart, and that hatred would follow him home unless he surrendered it. I asked him whether he believed dreams could be messages from God. He said that dreams could comfort, warn, or confuse people, so a wise person should never build his entire faith on a dream. Instead, he said, a person should test what he experiences against truth, humility, love, and the character of God. Those words gave me balance. I realized how dangerous it would be to chase strange experiences simply because they made me feel special. The mysterious encounter in the night had not made me important. If anything, it had made me feel smaller. It reminded me that I was only a man who could be wrong, a man who needed forgiveness, a man who needed to forgive. Before we left, the elderly man looked at me and said that sometimes the hardest journey was not the journey to a holy city, but the journey back to a person we had wounded. I immediately thought of Yusuf. I thanked him, and when we walked away, I told Farouk and Salman that I needed to call my brother again. This time, I did not wait for Yusuf to call me. I stepped away from the others and dialed his number. He answered quickly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I could hear him breathing on the other end, and suddenly I remembered how many years had passed since we had spoken without anger. I told him that I was sorry. I did not explain everything that had happened in Mecca. I did not tell him about the stranger or the dreams because I did not want to use a mysterious experience to force him to forgive me. I simply admitted that I had been proud, that I had hurt him, and that I had allowed 11 years to pass because I was waiting for him to make the first move. Yusuf began crying. He told me that he had also been proud. He said that many nights he had picked up his phone to call me and then put it down because he was afraid I would reject him. We stayed on the phone for a long time. Nothing magical happened. No bright light appeared. No voice came from heaven. Two brothers simply talked honestly for the first time in 11 years. And somehow that ordinary conversation felt more powerful to me than any dramatic sign could have been. After the call, I returned to Farouk and Salman, and I told them what had happened. Farouk hugged me. Salman placed his hand on my shoulder. Then Farouk said that he needed to make a call too. He called his eldest son. Salman called his sister, whom he had avoided for years because of an old family disagreement. One by one, we began doing the things we had been told to do. But there was still one question that refused to leave my mind. Why had the mysterious encounter happened to 3 Imams? Why had the message been about forgiveness instead of religious arguments? And why had Jesus been at the center of the dreams without asking us to become famous, powerful, or admired? That evening, while we were preparing to pray, Hamza sent one final message. He said his mother had passed away peacefully. Then he added that before she died, she had asked him to tell me something. My hands became cold when I read it. She had apparently told Hamza that God sometimes allows a person to walk through a dark night so that he can finally see what daylight had been hiding. I read those words again and again. Then I looked toward Farouk and Salman. None of us knew what the next day would bring. But I knew that when I returned to Pakistan, I could not simply resume my old life and pretend nothing had changed. There was something waiting for me in Lahore, something connected to Hamza, Yusuf, and the mysterious encounter in Mecca. When I returned to Lahore, I expected the journey to end at the airport, but it was only beginning. The first person waiting for me outside the arrivals area was my wife, Amina, and when she hugged me, she immediately noticed that something had changed. She asked whether everything had gone well, and I told her that it had, but I could not bring myself to explain the night in Mecca. How could I describe something I still did not fully understand? I had no proof that the man we met was physically Jesus, and I did not want my family to think I had lost my mind. But while we were driving home, my phone rang. It was Hamza. He asked if he could meet me as soon as possible. His voice carried a seriousness that made me agree immediately. The next afternoon, he came to my study carrying the same old notebook he had shown me before I left Pakistan. He placed it on the desk and opened it carefully. He had drawn the 3 of us again, but this time there was something different in the picture. Behind the 3 figures stood a 4th person, and beside that person was a small house. Hamza told me he had drawn it after another dream. In the dream, he said, the man in white had shown him that our journey was not finished in Mecca because something had to happen in Pakistan. He said the man had revealed that one of us would have to choose whether to speak openly about what had happened or remain silent out of fear. I immediately felt uneasy. I had no desire to become known as the Imam who claimed to have seen Jesus in Mecca. I knew what people would say. Some would call me a liar, others would call me confused. Some might even accuse me of abandoning everything I had believed. I told Hamza that dreams could be misunderstood and that we should be careful. He nodded, but then he asked me why I had been crying when I heard him mention Jesus. I had no answer. He then told me that before his mother died, she had asked him to give me something. From inside his bag, he brought out a small envelope. My name was written on it. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was his mother's handwriting. I opened it slowly, and inside was a short note thanking me for listening to her son when he was frightened. but there was another sentence at the bottom that made me stop. She had written that she believed true faith should make a person more loving, not more hateful. I read those words several times. They were simple, but they felt like a mirror. That evening I went home and found Yusuf waiting outside my house. For 11 years I had imagined what it would feel like to see my brother again, but when he stood in front of me, I suddenly felt like a child. Neither of us knew what to say. Then Yusuf smiled and said that I had become older. I laughed through my tears and told him that he had too. We hugged, and for a few moments I forgot everything else. We sat together for nearly 3 hours, talking about our father, our childhood, our mistakes, and the argument that had separated us. Yusuf told me that he had kept the old photograph of our father because he could not bring himself to throw it away. Then he told me something that surprised me. On the same night I had met the stranger in Mecca, Yusuf had dreamed about our father. He said his dream had not mentioned Jesus, Mecca, or anything religious. It was simply our father standing beside the old family house and looking at him with sadness. Yusuf said he woke with a strong desire to speak to me. That was why he had called. I listened quietly. I did not know whether these things were connected. I had learned enough during the journey not to force every event into a supernatural explanation, but I knew that something had changed. The bitterness I had carried for 11 years was gone. I realized that sometimes the answer to a prayer does not arrive as a miracle in the sky. Sometimes it arrives as the courage to make one phone call, open one door, or say one sentence that pride has prevented us from saying. Later that night, I called Farouk and Salman. Farouk told me he had reconciled with his son, and Salman said he had spoken with his sister after years of silence. We laughed at the strange way our lives had begun moving in the same direction. Then the conversation became serious. Farouk said he believed the encounter had not been given to us so that we could boast about it. Salman agreed. He said that if we told people about a mysterious man but remained proud and unforgiving, then we had completely missed the message. I knew they were right. Still, I had another concern. Hamza's notebook contained details that seemed impossible for him to know. I asked him to bring it to me again. The following morning he returned, and we examined every page together. There were drawings from several dreams, dates, places, and descriptions. Then we reached the final page. It contained a sentence about 3 men returning home and discovering that one of them would face a test involving his own congregation. I looked at Hamza and asked what he meant. He said he did not know. I closed the notebook, but a deep uneasiness remained in my heart. 2 weeks later, that test arrived. During Friday prayer, a man from our community approached me after the service and accused me of secretly studying Christianity. Someone had apparently heard rumors that I had spoken with Hamza about Jesus. The accusation spread quickly. By evening, several people were asking questions. Some wanted me removed from my position. Others demanded that I explain myself publicly. My old instincts returned immediately. I wanted to defend my reputation. I wanted to remind everyone of my years of service and religious teaching. I wanted to prove that I was still the same Imam they had trusted. But then I remembered the stranger in Mecca and what he had revealed about my pride. I realized that I was facing the exact test described in Hamza's notebook. The question was no longer whether I could win an argument. The question was whether I could respond with truth and humility. I told the people that I had experienced a deeply personal spiritual encounter during my journey and that it had forced me to examine my heart. I told them that I would not lie about what I had experienced, but I would also not use an unexplained encounter to manipulate anyone. I said that I had become convinced that hatred, pride, and unforgiveness could never represent the heart of God. Some people became angry, others listened quietly. One elderly man stood and asked me whether I still believed what I had taught for decades. I paused before answering. I told him that I was still seeking truth, but I could no longer pretend that my faith was only about winning arguments. I said that Jesus had become a question I could not push away, not because someone had forced me to ask it, but because the encounter had forced me to examine my own heart. The room became silent. I could feel the tension. Then someone at the back shouted that I was bringing confusion into the community. I looked around and realized that the hardest part of my journey had finally arrived. The night in Mecca had been frightening, but this was different. In Mecca, only 3 of us had been afraid. Now hundreds of people were watching me. And I knew that whatever I said next could change everything. I stood before the congregation and felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on me. For years I had stood in that same place with confidence, teaching, advising, and answering difficult questions. That day was different. My mouth felt dry, my hands were cold, and I knew that whatever I said would be repeated far beyond that room. I looked at the elderly man who had asked whether I still believed what I had taught for decades, and I told him that I was not going to pretend that I had all the answers. I explained that my journey had forced me to examine my heart, especially my pride, my anger, and the unforgiveness I had carried toward my own brother. I told them that I had encountered something in Mecca that I could not fully explain, and that the experience had made me think deeply about Jesus, forgiveness, and what it means to truly surrender one's heart to God. I did not claim that everyone had to accept my experience. I did not ask anyone to follow me. I simply told the truth about what had happened to me. Some people became angry, and one man walked out. Another accused me of bringing foreign ideas into the community, but then a young father stood near the back and asked me a question I will never forget. He asked whether I believed God could reach a person through a moment they did not understand. I looked at him and said that I believed God could use many things to awaken a person, but we must always seek truth carefully and never worship an experience. That answer changed the atmosphere. People stopped shouting, they began listening. I told them about my brother, about the 11 years of silence, and about the phone call I finally made after the encounter in Mecca. I told them that if a spiritual experience makes us more proud, more hateful, or more cruel, then we should question what we have experienced. But if it leads us toward humility, forgiveness, mercy, prayer, and a deeper search for God, then we should not ignore the lesson simply because it makes us uncomfortable. That evening, Farouk and Salman came to my home. We sat in the same study where Hamza had first told me about his dreams. The three of us were exhausted. Farouk placed his phone on the table and told me that someone had recorded part of my speech and shared it online. He said people were already arguing about what I had said. Some called me a traitor. Others called me brave. A few people claimed that I had invented the entire story to gain attention. Salman looked at me and said that perhaps we should stop speaking publicly about the encounter. For a moment I agreed. I was tired of defending myself. I was tired of people demanding proof of something I could not prove. But then I remembered the lesson that had followed us from Mecca. The experience was not given to us for fame. It was given to us for transformation. I told them that we should not chase attention, but we also should not lie because people were uncomfortable. We agreed that if we ever spoke about what happened, we would make it clear that we were sharing a personal testimony, not presenting an event as established history. That decision gave me peace. Then Salman opened his bag and brought out a small notebook. He said there was something he had never told us. He had written down every detail of his dream before we went to Mecca. He opened the notebook and showed us the page. There was a drawing of the three men standing in darkness while a fourth figure stood ahead of them. Underneath it, he had written a sentence about returning home and being tested by people who wanted certainty. I stared at the page. It matched what had happened, but then I noticed another detail. In the corner of the drawing was a small doorway. I asked Salman what it meant. He said he did not know. At that moment my phone rang. It was Hamza. I answered and he told me he had received another dream. This time he said he had seen a doorway in the house from his earlier drawings. He said the door was open, but behind it was darkness. He could hear people praying on the other side, but he could not see their faces. Then the man in white appeared and revealed that the doorway represented a choice. Hamza said the man had revealed that each person eventually reaches a point where he must choose between protecting his pride and following truth. I felt a strange silence settle over the room. Farouk asked Hamza whether he knew about the doorway in Salman's notebook. Hamza said no. Salman and I looked at each other. We had no explanation. The following morning, something happened that made the entire situation even more difficult. A Christian man named Daniel came to my study. He was a Pakistani man who had lived in Lahore for many years, and he had heard about my speech. He did not come to argue with me. Instead, he asked whether he could tell me something about Jesus. I agreed, but I warned him that I did not want a debate. Daniel smiled and said he had not come to win a debate. He had come because he believed I was asking a serious question. He opened a small Bible and spoke about Jesus as someone who taught people to love their enemies, forgive those who hurt them, care for the weak, and seek God with a sincere heart. He did not pressure me, he simply explained why Jesus mattered to him. I listened quietly. Then Daniel said something that pierced me. He told me that he had spent years defending his faith while secretly failing to live the love he claimed to believe. He said that following Christ had become real for him only when he stopped asking how to defeat people and started asking how to love them. I thought about the stranger in Mecca. I thought about Yusuf. I thought about the congregation. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to be right. Then Daniel placed the Bible on my desk and said I should read the words of Jesus for myself rather than accept what either Muslims or Christians told me about him. After he left, I sat alone for nearly an hour. I stared at the Bible but did not open it. I was afraid of what I might discover. That fear surprised me. I had always told people that truth should not frighten us, yet now that truth was standing in front of me and I was afraid to look directly at it. Finally, I opened the book. I began reading slowly. I did not know where the journey would lead me, and I was not ready to announce a new identity or make a public declaration. I simply wanted to know what Jesus himself had taught. And as I read, I began noticing something that disturbed me more than the strange encounter in Mecca. The Jesus I was meeting in the words before me was calling me to forgive, to love, to pray sincerely, to serve others, and to surrender my pride. Those were the same things the man in white had revealed to us. I closed the Bible and whispered a prayer. Then I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, Yusuf was standing there with a serious expression on his face. He told me that someone had come to see him asking questions about our family, Hamza, and my journey to Mecca. Then Yusuf handed me a piece of paper. At the top was a name I recognized immediately. It belonged to someone I had not seen in more than 20 years. And suddenly, I realized that the story was about to become much bigger than the three of us. I looked at the name on the paper Yusuf had handed me, and for several seconds I could not speak. It was Dr. Tariq Mahmoud, a former teacher of mine who had disappeared from my life more than 20 years earlier. Tariq had been one of the people who influenced me when I was a young religious student in Lahore, but we had separated after a serious disagreement about faith, mercy, and the way religious leaders should treat people who asked difficult questions. I had not heard his name in years, so seeing it on that paper felt like someone had opened a locked room in my memory. Yusuf told me that Tariq had recently returned to Lahore and had been asking about me. According to Yusuf, he had heard about my journey to Mecca and wanted to speak with me privately. I immediately became suspicious. I wondered whether someone was trying to trap me, embarrass me, or use my recent controversy against me. Farouk and Salman agreed that I should be careful, but I also felt that avoiding the meeting would only increase my fear. The next afternoon, Tariq came to my study. He was older, thinner, and walked with a cane, but I recognized his eyes immediately. We greeted each other politely, and for several minutes neither of us mentioned the past. Then he told me that he had been following the reports about my speech and had heard that I had experienced a strange encounter during my journey. I asked him who had told him. He said someone from our old circle had mentioned it. I expected him to criticize me, but instead he surprised me by asking one question, whether the encounter had made me more humble. I told him yes. He nodded and said that was the only part of the story that mattered to him. Then he opened a small folder and removed an old handwritten page. He told me that 20 years earlier, when we were both young, he had written a private note after a conversation we had about Jesus. I had completely forgotten the conversation, but Tariq remembered it clearly. He said I had once asked him why Christians spoke about Jesus as someone who could transform a person's heart. At the time, I had dismissed the question because I thought I already knew the answer. Tariq said he had always regretted that I never continued asking. Then he told me something that made me uneasy. He had experienced a similar dream many years earlier involving 3 religious men and a journey at night. He had never told anyone because he was afraid people would misunderstand him. I stared at him and asked why he was telling me now. He looked at me and said he believed the time had come for me to finish a question I had started 20 years earlier. That conversation changed the way I looked at everything. Tariq did not tell me to abandon my family, insult my community, or accept his beliefs without thinking. He simply encouraged me to read the teachings of Jesus directly and ask God to show me the truth. He told me that he had spent much of his own life afraid of questions because he thought questions were signs of weak faith. Eventually, he said, he learned that sincere questions could lead a person closer to God if the person was willing to follow the answer wherever it went. After he left, I sat alone and remembered the young man I had been 20 years earlier. I remembered how confident I was, how quickly I judged people, and how easily I confused certainty with wisdom. I thought about my brother Yusuf and realized that I had done the same thing to him. I had been so sure that I was right that I never stopped to ask whether my attitude was wrong. That evening, I opened the Bible Daniel had left with me and began reading again. I started with the teachings of Jesus that spoke about forgiveness, mercy, prayer, humility, and love. I read slowly because I did not want to rush. Some passages challenged me deeply, others made me uncomfortable. I kept asking myself whether I was reading to understand or simply reading to find reasons to reject what I saw. That question forced me to slow down. Then I reached the words about loving enemies and praying for people who hurt us. I stopped. I thought about the men who had accused me publicly. I thought about the people who had mocked my story. I thought about Yusuf, then I thought about myself. I realized that I had spent years asking other people whether they were living according to God's will, but I had rarely asked whether I was doing the same. I prayed that night with a sincerity I had not felt in many years. I told God that if I was wrong about anything, I wanted the courage to know it. I asked for truth, even if truth cost me my reputation. I asked for humility, even if humility meant admitting that I had been mistaken. And I asked for the strength to love people who might never understand my journey. When I finished praying, I felt no supernatural voice and saw no vision. Instead, I felt a quiet conviction that I needed to continue reading and seeking. The next morning, I called Farouk and Salman and told them about Tariq. They were surprised that he had experienced something similar years earlier. We decided to meet at my house that evening, but before they arrived, another unexpected visitor came. It was Hamza. Hamza looked different when he entered the room. He was no longer the frightened young man who had first come to my study. His mother's death had changed him. He seemed quieter, but there was also a new strength in his face. He told me that after his mother died, he had found one more page inside her old Bible. I was surprised because I did not know she had owned one. He said she had received it years earlier from a Christian friend, but had kept it privately because she did not want anyone to misunderstand her. On the page, she had written notes about Jesus, forgiveness, and the meaning of surrender. Hamza gave me the page, and I read it carefully. His mother had written that she believed a person could spend a lifetime talking about God and still miss the heart of God's message if pride remained in control. Those words felt painfully familiar. Then Hamza told me something else. He said that the dreams had stopped. Since the night we met in Mecca, he had not dreamed about the man in white even once. I asked him why he thought the dreams had stopped. He looked at me and said he believed the dreams had served their purpose. I asked what he meant. He said perhaps we had been looking for a sign when what we really needed was obedience. His answer stunned me because it was the same lesson I had slowly been discovering. Before he left, Hamza looked at me and asked whether I believed the man in Mecca was Jesus. I remained silent for a long time. Finally, I told him that I believed the encounter had brought me face to face with truths that Jesus taught, but I did not want to build my faith on a mysterious appearance. I wanted to know Jesus through his words, his character, and the way his teachings changed my life. Hamza smiled and said that was why his mother had told him to read the Bible for himself. After he left, I returned to my study and opened the Gospel again. This time, I was not reading to win an argument. I was reading because I wanted to know. And as the weeks passed, the question became harder to escape. I began to see Jesus not simply as a figure in a religious debate, but as someone calling me to surrender my pride, forgive deeply, love sacrificially, and place my entire life before God. But accepting what I was discovering would come with a price. I knew my family might not understand, my community might reject me, my position as an imam could disappear. And one evening, Farouk arrived with news that made that fear real. He told me that the leaders of our religious council had heard about my private Bible studies. They wanted me to appear before them and explain myself. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday. The Friday meeting was held in a private room behind the mosque, and when I walked inside, I immediately felt the tension. 7 senior religious leaders were seated around a long table, and I recognized every face. These were men I had respected for years. Some had taught me when I was young, and others had stood beside me during difficult moments in my ministry. But that morning, nobody smiled. A folder containing reports about my journey, my conversations with Hamza, my public statement, and my study of the Bible was lying in front of the chairman. He asked me whether the reports were true. I told him they were. He asked whether I had met Christians in Pakistan. I said yes. He asked whether I had been reading the Bible. Again, I said yes. Then he asked the question I knew was coming, whether I had accepted Jesus as Lord. The room became completely silent. My heart was beating so loudly that I could hear it. I remembered the man in white in Mecca. I remembered Yusuf. I remembered my mother's voice from childhood telling me that God sees the heart. I remembered the tears of Farouk and Salman. Most of all, I remembered the prayer I had made when I first opened the Bible, that God would show me truth even if it cost me my reputation. I told the men that I could no longer deny what had happened inside me. I explained that I had come to believe that Jesus was not merely a subject for religious arguments, but the one who had called me to repentance, forgiveness, humility, and a deeper relationship with God. I did not pretend to understand every theological question. I did not claim that my experience proved everything to everyone. But I said that I could no longer turn away from what I had discovered while sincerely seeking God. The chairman looked disappointed. Another man became angry and accused me of betraying everything I had spent my life teaching. I listened without fighting back. Then they told me that I could no longer serve as an imam in that mosque. My position was taken away that same day. I walked out carrying only a small bag and my old prayer beads. I had spent more than 20 years building that life, and in less than an hour it was gone. Outside, I sat alone on a bench near the mosque and cried. That evening I went home expecting my wife to be angry. Instead, Amina sat quietly and listened as I told her everything. I told her about the encounter in Mecca, the dreams, the Bible, the meeting with the council, and the decision I had made. I told her I did not know what our future would look like. I told her I might lose friends, I might lose my position. People might speak badly about our family. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me one question, whether I had made the decision because I was afraid of people or because I sincerely believed God was leading me. I told her that I had tried to be sincere. She took my hand and said she would need time to understand everything, but she would not stop loving me. Those words nearly broke me. My daughters were confused, and I did not burden them with every detail. Instead, I told them that their father was on a journey of faith and that they should always seek God with an honest heart. The weeks that followed were difficult. Some old friends stopped visiting. People whispered when they saw me in public. A few relatives accused me of bringing shame on the family. Others told Amina that she should leave me, yet something strange happened during those difficult weeks. People I had never expected began coming quietly to my home. Some were Muslims with questions about Jesus. Some were Christians who had heard my story. Others were simply broken people who wanted someone to pray with them. I realized that my calling had changed. I no longer stood behind a pulpit trying to prove that I knew everything. I sat in a small room with people who were hurting, and I listened. I prayed with them. I studied the scriptures with those who wanted to study. I encouraged people not to follow me blindly, but to seek God personally. Farouk and Salman continued meeting with me. Their own journeys were not identical to mine, but they remained my brothers. We agreed that our experience in Mecca should never become a reason to attack people of another faith. We had seen how quickly pride could turn faith into a weapon. Instead, we wanted our lives to show forgiveness, mercy, honesty, and love. Then one afternoon, nearly 6 months after our journey, something happened that brought the entire story back to where it began. Hamza came to my house carrying his mother's old notebook. He opened it to a page he had never shown me. At the top was the date of her first dream about Jesus. Beneath it was a description of 3 men traveling to a holy city. But at the bottom of the page was a name. It was my name. I stared at it in disbelief. Hamza explained that his mother had written my name years before I ever knew about her dreams. She had apparently prayed for me for a long time, asking God to soften my heart and guide me toward truth. I asked him why she had never told me. He said she had been afraid I would misunderstand her. I closed the notebook and cried. That night, I sat alone in my study and thought about everything that had happened. Now I understood that the mystery was never supposed to become the center of my life. The center had to be God, The final question was not whether people believed my testimony. The final question was whether I would continue walking with God when nobody was watching.